Meg Bennett had struggled for a long time to piece her life back together after a devastating loss. 3 years ago, her husband, the father of her daughter, Emma, died in a car accident, leaving the two of them alone and shattered. That period was the darkest of Meg's life. Financial instability, countless nights spent crying, and the responsibility of supporting her 15-year-old daughter, who was struggling to cope with the loss of her father. When Will entered their lives, everything changed. He appeared like a light at the end of the tunnel. Handsome, confident, and naturally charming. Will was a successful businessman who inspired trust from the moment they met. His care for Meg was not only practical but also emotional. He had a way of saying the right things during the toughest moments, convincing her that life could begin anew. Desperately in need of support, Meg couldn't help but be drawn to his confidence. For Emma, Will initially became a source of comfort as well. Her father had been her hero, and his death left a gaping hole in her heart. Will quickly figured out how to connect with a grieving teenager. He brought her ice cream after school, asked about her hobbies, and showed interest in her favorite books and movies. He even attended some of her school events when Meg was tied up with work. On Emma's birthday, he gifted her a gold bracelet with a delicate engraving. For my special girl, Emma was enchanted by the gesture. And while Meg found it surprising, she brushed it off as an act of fatherly care. They started living like a typical suburban family. Shared dinners, movie outings, and planning future vacations. Will never failed to emphasize that their happiness was his top priority. He took an active role in home renovations, bought new furniture, and even helped Emma redecorate her room. Neighbors viewed them as the perfect family. Meg began smiling again, feeling like her life was finally getting back on track. But the illusion of happiness didn't last long. A few months after their wedding, Meg began noticing changes in Emma. At first, it was small things. Emma grew more withdrawn, avoided conversations with her mother, and spent longer hours in her room. Then came bouts of sudden crying, which Emma tried to hide. Meg chalked it up to teenage struggles, but a nagging feeling told her something was wrong. Will continued to act as caring and friendly as ever, but Meg occasionally noticed moments when he and Emma would whisper to each other. When she entered the room, the conversations would abruptly stop, and Will would dismiss it with, "We were just talking about her schoolwork." Once, passing by Emma's room, Meg saw Will place his hand on Emma's shoulder, leaning in to whisper something. The scene appeared innocent, but Meg couldn't shake her discomfort. The turning point came during a casual conversation with a neighbor. The woman mentioned offhandedly that she often saw Will and Emma together at a nearby cafe. Though Will had never mentioned these outings, Meg began quietly gathering evidence but kept her suspicions to herself. The cracks in her seemingly perfect marriage started to show. Meg began questioning if Will was truly the ideal husband and stepfather he appeared to be. At first, Will's attentiveness to Emma seemed like genuine care. He frequently asked about her day, recommended books to read, and even helped her choose paints for her art projects. But over time, his behavior stopped feeling normal. Meg remembered one incident when Will convinced her to stay home and rest while he offered to drive Emma to art school. When they returned, Meg noticed Will carrying 2 bags, even though Emma already had all the supplies she needed. He explained, "I thought she could use some better tools. You see how talented she is." Emma looked uneasy but didn't object. Meg smiled but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Another time, Will took Emma to a sports store to buy new sneakers. When they returned, Meg noticed additional expensive accessories along with the shoes. Will smiled and said, "It's important for her to look her best during practice." The situation only deepened her unease. Meg also began noticing that Will's comments about Emma crossed boundaries. He frequently commented on her appearance in ways that made Meg uncomfortable. During one dinner, Will said, "You look so elegant. It's hard to believe you're still a teenager." Emma gave an awkward smile, while Meg felt her stomach twist in discomfort. She tried to change the subject but couldn't shake the sense that the comment was inappropriate. One evening, as they watched a movie together, Will, sitting next to Emma, placed his hand on her shoulder and said, "You're my shining star." Emma quickly moved to the other side of the couch, and Meg's unease grew stronger. Emma, too, had changed. She stopped sharing details about her life, avoided eye contact with her mother, and seemed perpetually tense and exhausted. Meg tried to talk to her multiple times, but Emma's response was always the same. "Mom, I'm fine. Just a lot of schoolwork." She also began spending less time at the dinner table, excusing herself quickly to retreat to her room. One evening during dinner, Will said, "Emma, you're so smart. I'm sure everyone will admire you in the future." Emma blushed and muttered a quiet, "Thanks." Unable to hold back, Meg said, "Will, don't you think it's a little strange how often you compliment her? Maybe you should focus more on your wife." Will smiled, unfazed, and replied, "I just want her to feel confident." The tension in the room was palpable. Emma finished her meal quickly and left the table. The final straw came one evening when Meg returned home from work to find Will and Emma sitting on the couch. Will was leaning close to Emma, holding her hand as if explaining something. When Meg entered, they quickly pulled apart. "What's going on here?" Meg asked. "We were just talking about her school project," Will replied with a smile. Emma said nothing, but her guilty expression spoke volumes. That moment solidified Meg's fears. She could no longer ignore what was happening. That night, while cleaning the kitchen, Meg noticed Will's phone left unattended on the table. He had gone to the garage, leaving the screen unlocked. A notification lit up the screen, and Meg couldn't help but glance at it. The message made her heart stop. "You make me happy. I'm always thinking about us." Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone and opened the messages. The conversation was filled with texts from a contact saved as Sunshine. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me. No one understands me like you do. I can't wait for us to be together again." Meg read through text after text, including one that mentioned, "A week without you felt unbearable," and "that special place in our hearts where it's just us." It felt like a cruel joke, but the undeniable truth was staring her in the face. The next morning, determined to find confirmation of her suspicions, Meg searched Emma's room. Inside the closet, she found a small jewelry box. It contained a pair of earrings adorned with tiny diamonds, looking very expensive. On the back of one of the earrings, there was an engraved inscription, "For my special girl." Meg felt her hands begin to tremble again. She recalled Will mentioning not long ago, "I love spoiling Emma with little things. She deserves it." At the time, Meg had thought it was a sweet gesture of care. But now, she realized these weren't just little things. A few days later, Meg came home earlier than usual, intending to surprise her family. She went upstairs, expecting to hear Emma and Will chatting. Instead, her attention was drawn to the silence. The door to their bedroom was slightly ajar. Peeking inside, Meg saw something that nearly knocked her off her feet. On her bed, tangled in an embrace, lay Will and Emma. Both were almost naked. Emma was in her underwear, and Will's pants were unbuttoned. They lay close, like a couple smiling and whispering to each other. Meg froze. Her breathing grew heavy, but she didn't make a sound. She backed away and quietly went downstairs as if nothing had happened. Her mind was racing, and her heart ached with betrayal. She knew her world was crumbling, but she hadn't yet decided how to act. That same day, she found a receipt in Will's briefcase from a jewelry store. It listed diamond earrings with engraving. The receipt was dated the day Will claimed he had an important meeting. Meg sat on the couch, holding the receipt in her hands. Her mind no longer tried to justify his actions. She knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. But how to confront them? Meg couldn't keep quiet anymore. She had all the proof she needed that her husband and daughter had betrayed her. Her heartache, filled with pain and anger, began to take over her every thought. They had broken her trust, destroyed the family she had worked so hard to rebuild. She knew a simple confrontation wouldn't change anything. Will would deny it and Emma would just shut down. But they had to face the consequences of their actions. Meg decided she needed a plan to regain control and force them to confess. She remembered the cabin in the woods, a remote, isolated spot where they had spent time years ago. It was the perfect place to force the truth to the surface. On a warm Saturday morning, Meg suggested they spend the day together. She proposed going to the forest to gather mushrooms and enjoy nature. Will and Emma, suspecting nothing, agreed. "Let's spend time as a real family," Meg said, masking her anger with a calm tone. They drove out together, bringing baskets, a thermos of tea, and some snacks. Meg kept her composure the entire time, though her mind replayed the things she had seen and discovered. Will joked around, Emma stayed quiet, and Meg silently observed them. The forest was peaceful, the fresh air filling their lungs, but inside Meg, everything was boiling. She led them deeper into the woods, explaining that there were more mushrooms further in. They wandered among the trees for a long time until the sun climbed high and everyone began feeling tired. "I think we should take a break," Meg suggested. "Let's head to the cabin. It's not far from here." Will agreed, and Emma simply nodded. They made their way to the old cabin they had used for retreats years ago. The cabin looked run down, wooden walls, the smell of dampness and aged timber. Inside were a table, a few chairs, and a couch near a small fireplace. Meg invited them in, offering snacks and a rest before heading back. "I'll make some tea," she said, taking out the thermos and cups. As they sat around the table, Meg watched their every move. She noticed how Emma avoided her gaze and how Will acted too casually, as if nothing had happened. Her thoughts were loud in her head. "They think I don't know, but that won't last much longer." Meg poured tea into the cups, adding a few drops of a sedative to Will's and Emma's drinks. She pretended to sip her tea but didn't actually touch it. "This has been a lovely day," Meg said with a strange smile. "Yeah, we should do this more often," Will replied, completely unaware of her plan. Emma stayed quiet, sipping her tea slowly and avoiding her mother's gaze. Within minutes, Will began to look drowsy. "I'm feeling a bit tired," he said, leaning back in his chair. Emma also seemed to feel the effects. "Stretching," she said. "Mom, I think I'll lie down for a bit, if that's okay." As Will and Emma drifted into sleep on the couch, Meg stood in the room, looking at them. Her heart raced, but for the first time in a long while, she felt in control. She stepped closer, watching as they lay helpless before her. "They thought they could fool me, thought I wouldn't find out. But now everything is going to change," she thought. Meg felt a surge of adrenaline that made her heart pound even harder. She pulled ropes from her backpack, something she had brought in. Advanced and carefully, Meg began tying their hands and feet to ensure they couldn't escape. When she finished, she sat down on a chair across from them, gripping a knife tightly in her hands as she waited for them to wake up. Will and Emma, bound tightly with the ropes, lay together on the couch. The knots secured their arms and legs so firmly that any attempt to free themselves would be futile. Their faces remained relaxed from the sedative, but Meg knew it wouldn't last long. Her thoughts swirled around everything they had done. Months of lies, betrayal, and hypocrisy had culminated in this single moment. She now had the opportunity to make them pay, and the feeling was almost intoxicating. Her eyes darted between Emma and Will. He was the cause of all this horror, and he would answer for it. When Will started to slowly regain consciousness, Meg rose from her chair. Her eyes burned with a mixture of rage and pain, and her knuckles whitened from how tightly she was gripping the knife. She stepped closer, staring at his face, which was beginning to show confusion and fear. Will tried to move, but the ropes held him firmly in place. His eyes quickly locked on the knife in Meg's hands. His voice, hoarse and unsure, broke the silence. "Meg, what are you doing? Calm down." Meg leaned in closer, her voice low but piercing. "You have no idea how long I've waited for this moment. You destroyed everything. Our family, my life, her life." Her hands raised the knife, and in that moment, she wasn't thinking anymore. Only one thought consumed her. He has to pay for this. Will tried to pull back, but he was powerless. Meg lifted the knife higher, her face set with determination. She was ready to strike when a voice behind her stopped her cold. "Mom, no. Please, don't." Meg spun around sharply. Emma, who had been motionless until now, was sitting up, crying. Her eyes, filled with raw terror, locked on her mother. Her voice, broken by sobs, pleaded, "Mom, I'm begging you. Don't do this. It won't fix anything." Meg froze, the knife in her hand hovering midair. She looked at her daughter, who now seemed not just a victim but a part of this nightmare. "Emma," Meg whispered, her voice trembling as tears welled up in her eyes. "How can you ask me this? Look at what he's done to you, to us." Emma sobbed, trying to compose herself. "I know, Mom, but if you do this, you'll lose everything. You'll go to prison. They'll take you away from me. Please." The words hit Meg like a blow. Her hand, which had held the knife with unwavering resolve a moment ago, now wavered. She looked back at her daughter, then at Will, who lay silent before her. His wide eyes said nothing, but they revealed his fear. Slowly, Meg lowered the knife. Her body trembled as if she had just woken up from a terrible dream. She stepped back and sat down at the table, burying her head in her hands. Her breathing was ragged, and her heart pounded so loudly she could barely think. "He has to pay for this," she said, looking at Emma. Emma nodded, her tear-streaked face trembling. "We'll make him pay, Mom, but not like this. Not this way." Meg still clutched the knife, but her grip had weakened. She realized she had crossed a dangerous line, and though every fiber of her being wanted to end it, she couldn't sacrifice her life for him. Her breathing began to steady, but her eyes remained fixed on Emma. Her daughter continued to cry, tears streaming down her cheeks, leaving wet trails on her skin. She could no longer hide the truth. "Mom," Emma began, her voice shaking, "he ruined everything. I didn't know what to do." Meg slowly lifted her head, her voice quiet but firm. "Tell me everything. No lies. I want to know how far this went. How did he force you into this?" Emma nodded slightly, swallowing her sobs before speaking. "It started when I was 15. He was always kind, caring. He always praised me, told me I was beautiful, that I was growing up. First, it felt nice, like attention." Meg listened intently, gripping the knife as though it could give her the strength to endure Emma's words. "Then, he started giving me gifts, earrings, bracelets, books. He said it was our little secret that you wouldn't understand." Meg began shaking her head quietly but didn't interrupt. "He always found excuses to be around me. He told me I was special, that he understood me better than anyone else. And then..." Emma's voice trailed off, breaking. Meg couldn't hold back and sharply asked, "What did he do, Emma?" The girl sobbed and whispered, "He said it was normal, that it wasn't like regular relationships, that we were special, and I believed him, Mom. I was so stupid." Meg slammed the knife against the table, making Emma flinch. Her voice was filled with fury. "You're not stupid. This is his fault. He manipulated you. He used your vulnerability." Emma continued, struggling to compose herself. "He said if anyone found out, it would destroy all of us, that you'd never forgive me. I was scared to tell you." On the couch, Will began to stir. His eyes opened, and the first thing he saw was Meg holding the knife and Emma crying beside her. He tried to move, but the ropes held him tightly. "Meg, what the hell is this? What are you doing?" he croaked, trying to buy time. Meg stood slowly, her face full of rage. She approached him and said, "You manipulated my daughter, forced her. Do you think I don't know?" Will, who had previously seemed confident, now began to panic. "It's all lies. She made this up to turn you against me. Emma's always been unstable." "Shut up." Meg raised the knife, its blade gleaming in the light. "You made her a victim. You destroyed our family." Will tried to defend himself, but every word only fueled Meg's anger. Emma, seeing her mother approach Will with the knife again, began crying harder. "Mom, please don't do this. You'll lose everything. We'll find another way. Just stop this." Meg froze, the knife hovering in the air. Her breathing was heavy, and her heart pounded so fast it felt like it would burst. "If I don't do this, he'll find a way to escape punishment," she said. "We'll turn him over to the police," Emma shouted, desperate to convince her. "He won't get away with this if we handle it the right way." Meg hesitated. She looked at Emma, then back at Will, who now appeared utterly terrified. Finally, she lowered the knife and dropped it onto the table. You're right, Emma. I can't lose you because of him. But I will put an end to this nightmare. Meg untied Emma, leaving Will bound. She pulled out the phone she had hidden earlier and dialed the police. Her voice was cold and steady. I need to report physical abuse and manipulation of a minor. Arrest him before I change my mind. Emma let out a sigh of relief, though tears still streamed down her face. She hugged her mother, who now looked completely drained. This isn't over yet, Mom, but we'll get through it together, Emma said, holding her mother's hand. Meg nodded silently. She knew now that she had chosen the right path. Meg sat motionless, clutching the phone she had just used to call the police. The sound of sirens could already be heard in the distance, but the room was filled with tense silence. Will, still bound, lay on the couch, struggling uselessly against the ropes. Meg, think this through. The police won't fix anything. We can handle this ourselves, he rasped. Meg shot him a cold glare. Enough. Your lies have no power here anymore. Emma, sitting against the wall and wiping her tears, whispered, Thank you, Mom. The sirens grew louder. Meg went to the door, and as soon as it opened, 2 police officers entered the cabin. They quickly took her phone as evidence and asked a few brief questions. Will was lifted to his feet, handcuffed, and escorted out despite his protests. It's all lies. She made it up, he shouted, but his words were lost in the cold air. Meg approached Emma, who was silently crying. She sat beside her and embraced her daughter. It's over now. We did it, she said softly. A month later, the court delivered its verdict. Meg and Emma attended every hearing, sitting in the courtroom as Will's case was tried. All the evidence Meg had gathered, including text messages, gifts, and Emma's testimony, became critical to the case. Will tried to defend himself, accusing Meg of exaggeration and claiming Emma had misinterpreted his intentions. But the prosecution's attorneys presented a clear case in Emma's defense, dismantling all of Will's arguments. When the judge announced the verdict, 15 years in prison for child molestation and sexual exploitation, the courtroom fell silent. Will, who had tried to maintain his composure throughout the trial, finally bowed his head, realizing there was no escape. After the trial, Meg and Emma decided to focus on rebuilding their lives and relationship. Together, they sought therapy to process what they had endured. Emma worked on regaining her ability to trust others, while Meg worked on forgiving herself for not recognizing the danger sooner. During one session, Emma finally admitted, I was so scared you'd blame me, Mom. Meg took her hand and replied, This was not your fault, and I'll do everything I can to make sure you feel safe from now on. Those words marked the beginning of their healing. Months passed. On a warm spring day, Meg and Emma sat on a park bench. Meg watched as the sunlight filtered through the branches while Emma read a book. Their lives were far from easy, but now there was hope. Mom, do you think we'll get through this? Emma asked, closing her book and placing a bookmark inside. Yes, sweetheart. We're already on our way. The most important thing is that we're together, Meg replied, wrapping her arms around her daughter. Their path to recovery was long and challenging, but they knew there was light ahead.